Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Before we dive into today's story, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now. We upload a brand new story every single day, stories that make you think, stories that stay with you long after you've heard them. And if you enjoy what you're about to hear, smash that like button. It really helps us keep bringing you these tales. Alright, let's begin. Humanity experienced its first great silence beneath the waters. This is not a story of certainty. This is not a claim of absolute truth. This is a telling, a remembering, a whisper passed down through countless generations until it became something between history and myth. What follows is the story of the flood, the deluge, the great waters that some say once covered the world. Whether you believe it happened exactly this way or see it as a lesson wrapped in metaphor, the core remains the same. A warning was given. It was ignored. And the world learned what it means when patience runs out. The world before the flood was loud. Not loud in the way we understand noise today, with machines and traffic and constant digital hum. It was loud with human presence, with the sound of too many voices speaking and none of them listening. The earth had grown crowded. Communities sprawled across valleys and plains. People built and expanded and multiplied, generation after generation, until the landscape itself seemed to pulse with human activity. There was laughter in the markets, shouting in the streets, arguments over land and water and livestock. Life was abundant, chaotic, relentless, but beneath all that noise, something had shifted. The world had not become evil overnight. There was no single moment when everything turned dark. Instead, it was a gradual forgetting. People forgot to look up at the sky with gratitude. They forgot to treat the earth with care. They forgot that their actions had weight, that cruelty compounded, that indifference was its own kind of violence. They lived as though the world owed them everything and they owed the world nothing. And so the fabric of their existence, once held together by shared respect and mutual care, began to fray. Yet the earth remained calm. The sun rose every morning without fail. The rivers flowed in their ancient courses. Crops grew in their seasons. Everything appeared stable, permanent, unchanging. Why would anyone believe that something catastrophic could happen when everything seemed so normal? This is the great deception of stability. It makes us believe that tomorrow will always look like today, that the patterns we know will continue forever. But the earth does not announce its limits. It simply reaches them. In the midst of this loud, crowded, forgetful world, there was a man named Noah. He was not a king. He was not a warrior or a priest or someone whose voice naturally commanded attention. He was ordinary in almost every way except one. He listened. While others filled their days with noise and distraction, Noah paid attention to the quieter things. The way the wind shifted before a storm. The patterns in the behavior of animals. The subtle changes in the world that others overlooked. And one day, through whatever means such knowledge comes, whether divine whisper or deep intuition, Noah understood something terrible. The world was about to change. The waters were coming, so Noah began to warn people. He walked through the markets and spoke to anyone who would listen. He stood in public squares and raised his voice above the general clamor. He told them that the world they knew was ending, that a great flood was coming, that they needed to change their ways, that they needed to prepare. His message was simple. Turn back from cruelty. Remember gratitude. Understand that the earth has limits and those limits are real. But simplicity does not mean ease. His words fell on ears that did not want to hear. People laughed at him. Some grew angry, insulted by the suggestion that their lives needed changing. Others simply ignored him, too busy with their own concerns to care about warnings of distant catastrophe. This is the tragedy of foresight. Those who see what is coming are rarely believed until it is too late. Noah was not offering them speculation or fear-mongering. He was offering them a chance. But a chance requires belief, and belief requires humility, and humility was in short supply. So the days passed, and Noah continued his warnings, and the world continued as it always had. The sun rose. The markets bustled. Life went on. And with each passing day, people became more convinced that Noah was simply a madman shouting at clouds. Then Noah did something even stranger. He began to build a ship. Not near water. Not by a river or a coast or even a lake. He built it far inland, in a place where the ground was dry and the nearest significant body of water was days away. The construction itself became a spectacle. People came from surrounding areas just to see the foolish man building a boat in the desert. They brought their children to point and laugh. They made jokes about Noah's sanity. Some offered mock advice about where he should sail his landlocked vessel. The ship grew slowly, day by day, year by year. Massive timbers hauled from distant forests, pitch applied to seal the seams. Compartments built inside, chambers and levels, space for things no one could understand the purpose of. The building took decades. This was not a quick project rushed in panic. This was slow, deliberate, faithful work. Noah and his family labored while the world watched and mocked. And here is what made it bearable, what allowed Noah to continue despite the ridicule. He was not building out of fear. He was building out of obedience, out of trust in something larger than himself. Whether you call that God or conscience or simply the certainty that comes from true knowing, it sustained him. The waiting was long. The work was hard. The mockery was constant. But the ship took shape. Imagine the patience required. Imagine waking up every day to the same task, knowing that everyone around you thinks you are wasting your life. Imagine your own doubts creeping in during the quiet moments. Imagine wondering if perhaps you misunderstood, if perhaps the warning was metaphorical rather than literal, if perhaps you have dedicated your entire existence to preparing for something that will never come. But Noah built anyway. He saw it and hammered and sealed. He measured and adjusted and continued. And the world kept turning, season after season, with no sign of any flood. Then one day, something shifted. Animals began to arrive. Not in ones and twos at first, but gradually, as if answering a summons only they could hear. Birds circled the ark and settled nearby. Creatures from the forests approached cautiously. Even predators and prey, who would normally never tolerate proximity, gathered in an uneasy peace around this strange wooden structure. People noticed. How could they not? But even this they explained away. Migration patterns, they said. Unusual weather affecting animal behavior. Anything but the admission that perhaps, just perhaps, Noah had been right all along. Noah and his family entered the ark. They brought the animals inside, pair by pair, species by species, filling the chambers that had seemed so unnecessarily large. And then they waited. The door sealed. And still, nothing happened. The sky remained clear. The sun shone bright. People who had gathered to watch the spectacle eventually grew bored and wandered away. See, they said to each other. Nothing is happening. The madman has locked himself in his wooden prison, and the world continues exactly as it always has. Then came the first drop. Not a deluge. Not a torrential downpour. Just rain. Ordinary rain, the kind that had fallen countless times before. It pattered on roofs and darkened the dust in the streets. People glanced up, shrugged, and went about their business. Rain was normal. Rain was part of life. There was nothing apocalyptic about clouds and water. Children played in the puddles. Farmers welcomed the moisture for their crops. Life continued, but the rain did not stop. The first day passed, and the rain continued. People remarked on it, but were not concerned. Rainy seasons happened. The second day brought more rain, steady and persistent. By the third day, a few people began to feel uneasy, but they told themselves it would pass. It always passed. Rain could not fall forever. By the end of the first week, the streets had turned to mud. By the second week, the rivers had swollen beyond their banks. And still the rain fell, day and night, without pause, without mercy, without any sign of ending. The water rose slowly at first. It pooled in low-lying areas. It crept across fields and swallowed the edges of settlements. People retreated to higher ground, still believing this was temporary, still thinking they could outlast it. They moved their possessions, their livestock, their families to hills and elevated structures. They built platforms and second stories. They reassured each other that the rain would stop soon, that the waters would recede, that everything would return to normal. But the rain did not stop. And the water kept rising. What had been streets became canals. What had been fields became lakes. What had been hills became islands. The world was transforming before their eyes, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Panic set in slowly, then all at once. People who had ignored every warning, who had laughed at every prophecy, now scrambled desperately to survive. They climbed trees that were soon submerged. They clung to wreckage that could not support them. They screamed into the rain, but the rain did not answer. The flood was not violent. That is what people misunderstand when they imagine this story. They picture towering waves and sudden catastrophe, everything swept away in an instant of dramatic destruction. But that is not how it happened. The flood was patient. It was steady. It was inevitable. The water simply rose and rose and rose, claiming inches and feet and yards, day after day, until there was nowhere left to run. The violence was not in the water's speed but in its persistence. It did not need to rush. It had all the time in the world. One by one, the sounds of the world were swallowed. The marketplace chatter drowned in rising water. The bleating of livestock ceased. The crying of children faded into silence. Even the rain itself seemed quieter as it fell on an endless surface of water rather than solid ground. The world became monochrome, everything the same gray, the same wet, the same emptiness. The earth, which had been so full of life and noise and human presence, fell silent inside the ark. Time lost meaning. There were no landmarks to mark the passing days. No horizon to watch. No change in scenery. Just the constant gentle rocking of the vessel, the creaking of timbers, the sounds of animals settling into their spaces. Noah and his family could not see outside. They did not know what was happening to the world beyond their wooden walls. They only knew that they floated, suspended between what was and what would be, waiting in the darkness for something to change. How long did it last? The accounts vary. 40 days of rain, some say. 150 days afloat. Months upon months of waiting. But inside the ark, such measurements meant little. Without the rhythm of sunrise and sunset, without the markers of season and weather, time became elastic, strange. Days blurred into nights, blurred into days. The only constant was the water beneath them and the wood around them and the faith that had brought them here. This was the great test. Not the building, which had been hard but tangible, a task with visible progress. Not the gathering, which had been miraculous but brief. The test was the waiting. The test was continuing to believe when there was no evidence, no confirmation, no sign that anything would ever change. The test was sitting in darkness and trusting that eventually, somehow, there would be light again. And then, so gradually that it was almost imperceptible, something shifted. The rain stopped. Not with fanfare. Not with any dramatic announcement. It simply ceased. One moment it was falling, the next it was not. The silence that followed was profound. For months they had heard nothing but rain drumming on the ark's roof, and now even that was gone. The only sound was the lapping of water against wood and the breathing of the animals in their pens. The water began to recede. Slowly. So slowly that at first they could not be sure it was happening at all. But day by day, the ark settled lower. The rocking changed its rhythm. And then one morning, a jolt. A scraping sound. The ark had touched something solid. Land. Somewhere beneath the endless water, the earth still existed. They had not drifted into an infinite ocean. The world had not been completely erased. It had only been covered, and now it was revealing itself again. Noah sent out birds to test the air, to see if they could find any place to rest. The first returned quickly, finding no refuge. The second stayed away longer but came back eventually. The third, a dove, flew out and did not return. It had found a place to land. Life was possible again. The waters continued their slow retreat, revealing mud and rock and the bare bones of a drowned world. When finally they emerged from the ark, the door opening to blinding light after so long in dimness, what they saw was strange and familiar all at once. It was the same world. The same earth beneath their feet. The same sky above their heads. But it was different in every way that mattered. The landscape had been scoured clean. The structures humans had built were gone. The cities, the roads, the carefully cultivated fields, all erased. What remained was raw and primal and empty. The noise that had once filled every corner of existence was absent. The world was silent, waiting to be filled again with whatever would come next. Noah and his family stepped onto this new old world. The animals emerged behind them, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. They scattered in different directions, following instincts toward the habitats that would suit them. Life would continue. It always does. But it would be different now. Quieter. Smaller. More careful. The family that had survived carried with them the memory of everything that had been lost. They would tell this story to their children, who would tell it to their children, who would pass it down through generations until it became something more than history. It became a teaching, a warning, a reminder. What does the flood mean? That is the question every generation must answer for itself. Some see it as literal historical fact, evidence of divine judgment and the consequences of collective wrongdoing. Others see it as metaphor, a story about cycles of destruction and renewal, about the limits of excess, about what happens when societies forget the basic principles of balance and care. Both readings are valid. Both contain truth. The power of the story is not in proving whether it happened exactly as described, but in what it reveals about the human condition. We are warned. Always, in countless ways, we are warned. The climate shifts. The resources dwindle. The systems we depend on show signs of stress. But we are experts at ignoring what we do not want to see. We tell ourselves that things will continue as they always have, that the patterns we know are permanent, that there will always be more time to change course. We mock the voices calling for different choices, dismissing them as alarmists or fools. We continue our loud, busy lives, Convinced of our own permanence, the flood reminds us that patience has limits. Not just divine patience, if that is your framework, but the patience of natural systems, of ecosystems, of the fundamental balances that allow life to flourish. The earth can absorb only so much before it responds. And when it responds, it does not do so with warnings or second chances. It simply changes the terms of existence. The water rises. The land disappears. And those who did not prepare, who did not listen, who convinced themselves it could never happen, find themselves with nowhere to stand. But the story does not end in despair. That is crucial. The flood is terrible, yes. The loss is immeasurable. But life continues. The waters recede. The earth remains. A family and the animals they save step out into a world made new by destruction. There is hope in this. Not cheap hope, not the easy optimism that pretends difficult things are not difficult, but the deep hope that comes from survival, from perseverance, from the knowledge that endings can also be beginnings. Some floods change the world. Others change the memory of those who survived them. The Great Deluge did both. It reshaped the physical earth, covering and revealing, destroying and cleansing. But more than that, it reshaped how humanity understood itself. We learned that we are not permanent. We learned that the world does not exist solely for our use. We learned that warnings should be heeded and patience should not be tested beyond its breaking point. We learned that sometimes the greatest catastrophes are the ones we see coming but refuse to believe. The story of Noah's flood has endured for thousands of years across cultures and religions and geographical boundaries. Some version of it exists in traditions around the world, which tells us something important. Whether it happened once in history or many times in different places, or whether it is a deep metaphor that touches something universal in human experience, it persists because it speaks to truths we recognize. We know what it is to ignore warnings. We know what it is to assume stability will last forever. We know what it is to realize, too late, that we should have acted differently, and we know what it is to wait. The part of the story that often gets overlooked is the waiting inside the ark. The months of floating in darkness, not knowing if or when things would change. That is its own kind of flood, the flood of time, of uncertainty, of faith tested by absence of evidence. Noah and his family had to endure not just the catastrophe but the aftermath, the long, slow process of waters receding and world rebuilding. There was no quick resolution. There was only patience, the same patient endurance that built the ark in the first place. Perhaps that is the real lesson. Not that catastrophe comes, though it does. Not that warnings should be heeded, though they should. But that endurance matters. That faith in something beyond immediate gratification matters. That the ability to work toward a future you may not live to see, to prepare for outcomes you hope will never occur, to keep going when everyone around you says you are wasting your time, that ability is what saves us. Noah built for decades while the world mocked him. He waited for months in darkness while the world drowned. And when the waters finally receded, he emerged into a new world not because he was special or chosen in some arbitrary way, but because he did the work and bore the waiting. The flood was not punishment alone. It was also purification. The old world, with all its noise and cruelty and forgetting, was washed away. What emerged was an opportunity to begin again, to remember the lessons that had been forgotten, to rebuild with wisdom rather than recklessness. Whether that opportunity was seized, whether subsequent generations learned from what had been lost, that is another question. Human memory is short. The lessons of catastrophe fade with each generation that did not experience it directly. The flood becomes a story, then a legend, then something ancient and possibly mythical, until the warnings it contains no longer feel urgent, but the warnings remain urgent. That is what every generation must rediscover. The flood is not just something that happened once. It is a pattern, a possibility, a reminder that systems have limits and those limits are real. Whether the flood comes as water or fire or slow degradation, whether it is global or local, sudden or gradual, the principle is the same. We are warned. We have time to prepare. We have the capacity to change course. But we must choose to act while action is still possible, not after the rain has already begun. In the end, the story of Noah's flood is a story about choice. Noah chose to listen when others ignored. He chose to build when others mocked. He chose to trust in something he could not see rather than trust in the apparent stability of what he could see. And because of those choices, life continued. Not unchanged, not without loss, but it continued. That is the hope embedded in even the darkest stories. That choices matter. That preparation is not paranoia. That the work we do in faith, in patience, in defiance of mockery and doubt, that work can make the difference between extinction and survival. The world after the flood was quieter, emptier. It had to be refilled with sound and meaning and purpose. Noah and his descendants would have to build again, plant again, establish again all the things that make life worth living. But they did so with knowledge that the previous generations lacked. They knew fragility. They knew consequence. They knew that the world could end, and having lived through that ending, they knew both its terror and its strange mercy, that even in ending there can be beginning. So we remember the flood. We tell the story. We pass it down. And in the telling, we ask ourselves the questions it demands. What warnings are we ignoring? What preparations are we avoiding? What truths are we too busy or too frightened to face? The flood is always coming in some form. Maybe not water covering the whole earth. Maybe something else. But the pattern repeats. Excess leads to consequence. Ignoring limits leads to limits asserting themselves. Refusing to change leads to change being forced upon us. The question is not whether we will face floods. The question is whether we will be ready when they come. Whether we will have built our arks, literally or metaphorically. Whether we will have done the patient work that seems foolish until it becomes essential. Whether we will have listened to the warnings while there was still time to heed them. The story gives us a model, not just of disaster, but of survival through foresight and faith and work that spans decades. It asks us to be like Noah, not in some mystical sense, but in practical ways. To see what is coming. To prepare. To endure the waiting and the doubt. To trust that the work matters even when results are invisible. And when the waters finally recede, when we emerge into whatever new world awaits, we will carry with us the memory of what was lost and the knowledge that it did not have to be that way. That is the burden survivors bear. Not just that they lived, but that they remember when others forgot, that they heeded when others ignored, that they endured when others gave up. It is a heavy thing to carry, that knowledge, that memory. But it is also a gift, because it means we have learned. And if we have truly learned, then maybe, just maybe, the next flood can be prevented, or at least survived with less loss, less suffering, less silence. Some floods change the world. Others change the memory of those who survive them. The Great Deluge did both. It ended an age and again another. It silenced a world and eventually filled it with new sound. It destroyed and preserved. It was judgment and mercy, catastrophe and salvation, ending and beginning all at once. And it asks us, across the millennia, what we will do with the warnings we receive, the time we have, the choices we face. The rain always starts with a single drop. That is what we forget. We expect catastrophe to announce itself dramatically, to arrive with trumpets and thunder. But it arrives quietly. Just rain. Just water. Just gradual change that compounds day by day until suddenly the familiar world is unrecognizable. By then it is too late for most. But not for those who saw the first drop and understood what it meant, who began building before the rain, who prepared while others mocked, who endured the waiting because they trusted something deeper than appearances. This is the story of Noah's flood. A story of warning unheeded and faith rewarded, of patience tested and perseverance vindicated, of a world that ended and a world that began. It is a story we still need, perhaps now more than ever, in a time when the warnings multiply and the mocking continues and the storms gather on every horizon. The flood is not just history. It is prophecy. It is mirror. It is question. And how we answer that question will determine what world our descendants inherit, what stories they will tell about us, whether they will speak of those who listened or those who drowned in their own certainty that floods only happen to other people in other times. The waters rose. The world fell silent. And in that silence, those who had prepared, who had believed, who had worked in faith, they floated above the destruction and waited for the land to appear again. When it did, they stepped out into emptiness and began the long work of filling it with life. That is the story. That has always been the story. And it waits for us still, asking what we will build, what we will heed, what we will become in the time between the warning and the rain. Thanks for listening, everyone. If this story made you think, hit that like button and drop a comment below. What warnings do you think we're ignoring today? What would your arc look like? And don't forget to subscribe because we've got another story coming tomorrow that you won't want to miss. Until then, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and remember that sometimes the greatest floods happen in silence.